to be the director of the UN's genocide investigation. And I was simply given a list of about 100 different mass graves and massacre sites to go through and sort through tens of thousands of those corpses to begin to gather the evidence against the perpetrators. And in the midst of standing in literally mass graves where there were thousands of perfectly innocent people who'd been just hacked to death, what I recognize is every single day for 100 days, there were people in places of massacre in Rwanda who were crying out. But here on this mall, it would have been empty and silent. And they just would let it happen. And as I came away from that experience, honestly, I just dreamed of a better day. And I dreamed of a better generation. And can I tell you something? Here you are. You are the better day. You are the better generation. But now there's something you need to do. You need to finish what you started. Right? This is what the grown-ups will tell us, right? The grown-ups will say, if you start something, you should finish. You shouldn't be a quitter. If you've committed to something, you should finish it. The problem is, this is what the grown-ups say. This is not what the grown-ups do. And so you have got to be better. You have got to do better. And you need to help the grown-ups in these buildings be better. Because they want to be better. Because if you do not, they will just let the killing happen. Now, why is that? Why would perfectly good people in these buildings just let the terror continue in these LRA-affected regions? I think there's just three reasons for that. The first one simply is this. It's too far away. Right? It just feels too far away. Solzhenitsyn, who was this man who he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was in prison in the Soviet Union for year after year, and wrote about this horrific tragedy of the just murder of millions of people under Soviet communism. And he made the point that there's two different standards by which we measure all events in the world. Two standards. And it's simple. Whether or not that event is far or whether it is near. If it's near and close at hand, it's a tragedy and it's terrible and it's horrible, right? But if it is far away, it becomes what he called a tolerable disaster of bearable proportions. And that is what has happened with the struggle against the atrocities of the LRA. It's become something that's it's a tolerable disaster of bearable proportions simply because it's too far away. But you believe something different. You believe that all human life is equal. You believe that they actually matter, those who today are running in terror and fear from violence. That it doesn't matter whether they are near or whether they are far. In the sight of God and in the sight of all that is true, they deserve compassion and they deserve a defender. And you will be the ones who do that. Here's the other reason. Here's the other reason why they will do nothing. Because it's too complicated. Complexity gives grown-ups a reason to do nothing. Instead of fighting through the complexity, because things are complex, things are complicated, but instead of fighting through the complexity to get to a place of clarity so we can act, what happens is we allow the complexity to become what Martin Luther King Jr. said, the paralysis of analysis. So what we need to do is to fight through the complexity of things and make sure that we nevertheless act. Because history clarifies all the complexity. You know that 200 years ago, slavery was complicated for people. For your great-grandparents, Nazis in Germany for a number of decades were complicated. Apartheid in South Africa, for your parents, would have been a complicated issue for a while. Rwanda and the genocide was complicated. But what you know is that none of that is complicated now. Everybody can see that there was a right place to be and a side of justice, and some people were on it and some people were not. So likewise today, the world is complicated, but the situation in the LRA-affected regions of murder and rape and abduction, there's complexity. But that's a reason to think hard and to work hard through the complexity to get to a point of clarity so that we can act. And that's what you need the strength to do. Here's the third reason why the grown-ups will just let it happen. Is because it may not be popular to do something about it. It's just like junior high. It may not be popular, so let's not do it. The reason the Rwandan genocide happened, why they let the adults let it happen, there was a fear of the voters wouldn't think it was a popular thing to do. It's a waste of energy. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. A waste of money to stop mass atrocities. Can I tell you a little something about money? This Halloween, Americans spent $370 million on Halloween costumes for their pets. Wow. $370 million on Halloween costumes for our pets. Just so you know, that is about the entire national budget of the Central African Republic, where the most recent LRA attacks have been taking place. The idea that there is not the resources to actually go after those who commit these atrocities is simply not true. The question is, do we have the commitment and sense of clarity to actually do what is worth doing? Because it doesn't matter so much whether it's popular, because what you're doing is something different. What you're doing is changing what is popular, and that is called leadership. You've turned the tide. You've made Coney famous. You've turned the tide. You've moved the world now to make a commitment to stop it. You've actually moved the U.S. government and President Obama to actually send capacities now to actually remove Coney from the field. You have turned the tide, but now you gotta finish the job. I'm so glad you're going dancing tonight. I am so glad. Because any struggle that is worth fighting for is both a march and a dance. It's both a march and a dance, because joy is going to be the oxygen that sustains anything that's hard to do. And the harder it is to do, the more oxygen you need. So the longer the march, the more dancing you're going to need. So I hope you dance your pants off.
I like that.
But then after the dance is done, you get back to the march and finish the job. Any fight worth fighting takes a long time. My colleagues with International Justice Mission not long ago sent a man away to prison who had been enslaving scores of innocent men, women, and children in just a completely abusive, grinding life of slavery inside a rice mill. In order to send that one man to justice, it took my Indian lawyer colleagues in India 6 years to send that one man to prison. Not only that, it took them 6,000 hours at the courthouse. That's 1,000 hours more than any of you spent in 4 years of high school. And that is what it was required to make sure that this one man who is enslaving other human beings was being restrained and brought to justice. And you, likewise, need to do whatever it takes to finish the job. But here's my final thought for you. Coney is more committed than you. Coney is more committed to you. Think about this. What happens if he fails? If he fails, he loses his life or he goes to prison for life. What happens if you fail? You go to grad school. You get another red t-shirt. Coney is more committed today than you. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can find in your heart such iron and steel that he can know right now to a trembling in his heart that you will not go away. Right now, just decide that you will finish the job because you have two convictions. One, that all human life matters. And the God who made you is inviting you to be a better generation. Because the God of history does take attendance. And the God of history convenes a tribunal of our grandchildren. And they just ask us, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you? Where were you when the Nazis were murdering the Jews by the millions in Europe, and the Jews were leaving the shores of Europe and trying to get into the United States, and you wouldn't let them in? Grandma, Grandpa, like, where were you? Where were you when black citizens in the South were just trying to register to vote, and they're getting the snot kicked out of them just because they wanted to vote? Like, Grandma, where were you? Like, what was that? Or what about during World War II when they were marching our Japanese American neighbors off to internment camps, and you just let that happen? Like, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you? And when they were slaughtering hundreds of thousands of Rwandans, and there was nobody on the mall, like, where were you? Likewise, when our grandkids ask us, hey, what about that Coney and about that LRA and all the abductions and the violence and the murder, like, where were you? Grandma, Grandpa, where were you? And I hope you can say, I showed up. And I showed up on time. I showed up on time, and I finished the job. Let's do that together.